Last minute changes to a render can be a real pain, especially when you've already rendered out your PNG sequence. You work really hard to complete your project and there's something that doesn't look right, or a client wants to make some changes. I'm not pointing fingers, but it's mostly the client, right? Much of the time you can get away with using crypto passes to make color corrections or make minor adjustments, but sometimes you might need to remove or add something to your scene, and that means you need to render the whole thing again. Or does it? You may know this or you may not, but did you know that there's a solution to fix problems in your composition without having to render the whole frame? Well, there is. We have the ability to render out a region in the standard physical Redshift and Octane. This is extremely helpful. It's a handy tool to use. I've used this a lot in my workflow, making previews for clients, sharing ideas with my team, and it can help you cut down on render times. In this video, I'm going to run through some things to look out for when setting up your render region. They may seem trivial, but I think these are essential in producing the perfect composition. So without further ado, let's crack on. Hi, it's Beefy and welcome to my channel. If you haven't been here before, then this is where I post tutorials and breakdowns of my projects. If you're into design, 3D modeling, motion graphics, cinema 4D, X particles and the like, then you're on the right place. So why not start by subscribing today? It will really help the algorithm find this channel and help me make more content. And if you're feeling really adventurous, then tinkle that bell so you don't miss a thing. There are many reasons for using render region. It might be for making previews, speed up render times, but the one I'm going to show you today is something I've used in the past. I have on occasion used this technique to add or even remove something from a scene, or to make some adjustments, etc., and has cut a load of my render time. There are caveats to this process, there always is. Each situation is different and you need to know what to look for. For example, before you set up your render region, it is important for you to know how light and shadows work. It's essential, not just for a render region, but in general. This isn't a full-on tutorial about lighting and shadows, but it's important for you to know what to look for. Without getting too sciencey, let me explain. My other daytime job is photography and videography. Understanding how lights and shadows work is a skill that I've learned over the years, and it's something I've been able to implement into my renders. There are two types of shadows that you're concerned with, umbra and penumbra. In photography, these terms aren't used. You've probably heard of them when referring to solar and lunar eclipses. Umbra shadows are defined and have sharp edges and are a result of a single or focused point of light, like the sun for example. In photography, this is known as hard light. Penumbra shadows are soft and feathered around the edges and are a result of a large light source, like a softbox or an overcast sky. Even a light bulb will cast penumbra shadows. In photography, this is known as soft light. You find in most images there's a mix of the two, soft and hard light. Lighting defines the mood of a scene. With the right lighting, you can lead the viewer's eyes to key parts of the scene to help tell your story. That's hard and soft light in a nutshell. We can end up down a rabbit hole on the subject of light and shadows, but essentially this is all you need to know about shadows when selecting your region. I've rendered this scene with the physical render, and you can find this scene in the Cinema 4D library. It was created by Gustavo Henrique, and it's a great scene to demonstrate what you should look for when choosing a region to render. And knowing the pitfalls, we can make our composition look seamless. I chose this scene because of the soft shadows, colour bleed and reflections. The scene is lit by two softboxes and is subtly lit. The soft light really works here, it's creating an ambience that's appealing. The shadows aren't apparent, unlike a sunny outdoor scene where you can see clean sharp shadows and the direction of the light source. To demonstrate this, I rendered the same scene with a sun object to show the difference in shadows. Comparing the two different types of shadows, you can see the difference. Although the hard light render looks really awful, it's easy to identify the shadows and where they fall. But in the render with the soft light, visually appealing as it is, you can't see the fall off of the shadows. So when setting up the render region, it's easy to identify the shadows with hard light. Soft light can be problematic. Hard light and soft light are two things you really need to understand when selecting your render region. If you want to learn more about light and shadows, then I advise you to watch some photography tutorials about lighting to learn more. The other things to look out for are reflections, refractions and colour bleed. Is the object you are removing or adding seen in reflections, etc.? Adding something to the scene might also affect the lighting in the whole scene, so identify areas where shadows fall, colour bleed, reflections and refractions is very important. Okay, so I've jumped into After Effects and I have the same example render here, minus the volleyball net. I'm demonstrating this technique on a single frame and the principle is the same with a PNG sequence. In my beach scene, I wanted to add a volleyball net back into the composition and I just wanted to render a region instead of rendering the whole thing again. So the volleyball net is going to go here and I'm going to render a region around it there. So I added my volleyball net and I rendered the region, and so if we come down here, I have three renders on my timeline here. So I have the original render here, so I'm just going to switch that off. And I have two different regions that I have rendered. So I have a tightly cropped region here. And also I have a region which is a bit larger, which is taking into consideration my shadows and reflections there. Okay, so I'll bring this one back here. So let's have a look at the tightly cropped region. So I'm just going to turn this on and overlay this onto the original. And you can see at first it looks okay, but if we zoom in here, we can see that there is a difference between the two renders. There's an edge surrounding the region. Also the reflections in the sea are cut off. There's a big difference between the two renders here. You could probably wing it, add a feather around the region, blur it a little, but for me this is not acceptable. I mean, why go to that hassle when you could render a larger region without experiencing much time difference between the renders? So the second region I rendered, I took into consideration the shadows and reflections. I know where my light sources are, so I have a softbox over here and a softbox overhead, so I know where my light is coming from. I know my shadows are going to be penumbra, which is they're going to be feathered and they're going to be spread out over this area here. By imagining how the shadows will appear using hard light, I can make a good guess where my shadows will fall. So my volleyball net will cast a shadow near to the edge of the sand here. The feathering of the shadows in soft light will spread the shadows over a larger area. The other thing I needed to ascertain was, is the volleyball net going to be seen in the reflection of the water? Looking at the reflections in the sea, I can safely say that the volleyball net will be reflected in the water. I can see other objects' reflections like this coconut tree and the camper van. I can see the bucket here, I can see this ball here, and I've got the beginnings of a reflection here in the tightly cropped render region there. So I just needed to ascertain how much of the reflection is going to be showing in the water here. Okay, so I'm going to turn off this cropped render here, and I'm just going to put on the region that I took into consideration, the lights and shadows. And if I zoom in here, we can't see the join. So my region goes up to this edge here, down here, and we can't see a join, which is absolutely perfect. So this is going to be the solution for me. So I have all my shadows and I have all my reflections, and this is absolutely looking seamless, and that's the job done. It's easy to suss out the scene in Redshift and Octane because we have instantaneous playback in the viewers. In standard and physical, it's not that apparent, so setting up the interactive render region can be a pain at times, but having good assumptions of how light and reflections will play in the scene will benefit you. So when using render region, there are other things to take into consideration. So You've decided what region you're going to render, and even though you're rendering a small percentage of your whole composition, rendering times may vary. It all depends on how render heavy your scene is. Everything is still calculated in the background just so that you can render your region, geometry, lights, reflections, refractions and so on. So depending on the scene, you might save minutes or you might save seconds, so every scene is different, so just take that into consideration. Another thing to watch out for is noise. Eliminate as much noise as possible. My advice is to refrain from using denoisers in your render. Always do this in post. Denoising your renders may show different results in your main sequence and your render region, as the denoiser is relevant to the area that is being rendered and not the whole scene. Okay, so my advice is just to do your denoising in post. This might sound a bit obvious, but always use the same render settings in your main sequence and your render region to get the best possible results. Even though we've done our best to identify the best area for our render region and we match the render settings, and sometimes there's a difference between the two renders. I find this happens in Redshift often, and it's a slight difference in exposure. Hardly noticeable, but if this happens, I find that creating a mask on the render region layer and adding a feather in post works really well. So here's a tip that will help you avoid having to use render region in paid projects. When working with a client, always insist on working with a decision maker from the get-go. Only the decision maker can greenlight your final product. There may be more than one. Identify who they are and get them involved in the process. Also, make sure that when you're creating your contract with the client, stipulate your conditions. Changes to a final product means you have to charge extra for any changes, so make the client aware that working with a decision maker will save them time and money. And always, before accepting the job, ensure that you're working within a realistic time frame. There's nothing worse than rushing a project to deadline and making mistakes along the way. No one should feel pressured in their work. Next, I'm going to show you how to render your region in standard physical, Redshift and Octane. Okay, so I'm in Cinema 4D and I'm going to show you how to render a region in standard and physical. So this scene has been rendered in physical, but this works exactly the same as standard. So the way we're going to be doing this is to use the interactive render region. And what I'm going to do first is that I want to add a volleyball net into my scene here. So I've already made a preview, and I'm just going to come in here and we're just going to look at this preview here. And this is without the volleyball net. So I'm just going to be adding the volleyball net around about here. So I know I've already identified the areas that I want to render my region. So I know that my post for the volleyball net is just going to be just here, and I'm going to have these reflections come down here. And also I know that the shadow will fall over to the edge of the sand here and a little bit over the radio here. So this is going to be really feathered. So I've already identified my areas. I've already gone through some tips for you to identify your own areas. So I'm just going to crack on and do this. But I just find it helpful to use a reference of what I've already rendered. Okay, so I'm just going to move this down here. So I'm just going to add the volleyball net to the scene now. So I'm just going to hold Alt and double click here. Okay, so we've got our volleyball net there in our scene. And I'm just going to open up my interactive render region. And I've actually reduced my render settings because I want this to work a bit faster in my viewport here. So just for preview and just for working out your render region, I just reduced my render settings just to increase my workflow here. So I'm just going to open this up, and this is the area that I'm going to be rendering. So you can see that the settings have been reduced here, so I've got a lot of noise in here, but it will enable us to identify things. And the other thing with the interactive render region is that you can actually play around with this little arrow. It's not very apparent, but you can just make this really low res, or you can make this really high res. So using the high res, the interactive render region is going to work a little bit slower. Okay, so now this is the area that we're going to be rendering, and we can see that we've got some reflections here. It's going to be difficult for you to see the difference of the shadows. If I just bring this up here, so we can see that just here we're going to have some reflections down here, so we need to make sure this is included. So with the shadow of the volleyball net, we know that in hard light, we know that the fall of the shadow is going to be across here. But with the soft light, we know that this is feathered, and this is feathered all over this region here. Okay, so this is the region that we're going to be rendering. And just going to move this out of the way. So what we need to do, we need to tell the output settings that this is the region that we want to render. So the way we're going to do that is come to the output settings and just bring this up here. And what I need to do is come to the output tab here. And underneath the custom settings, we have render region. So if I just scroll that down, we're looking for information to put into these fields here. And the way we're going to do that is actually use this button here. And I'm just going to copy from IRR, which is interactive render region. So I'm just going to click that. And now we have the information that we need. And it's also enabled our render region. So just make sure that this checkbox is checked. And the other thing I'm going to do is come to my save tab. I'm going to make sure that my render region is going to be saved into a different folder. I don't want to be overwriting my original sequence. And the other thing I'm going to make sure is that my alpha channel is checked here. So when we render our region out, we're going to be rendering this area here. And with the alpha channel, we're going to have transparency around this area. So when we bring this into our compositing software, it's going to be easy for us to overlay this on top of our original render. So the other thing that you have to remember is that you're using the same render settings as your original render. So I changed my error threshold here, so I just need to make sure that that is the same as my original render, and I should have no problems. And also just make sure that you have eliminated as much noise as possible in both renders. And that's how you're going to render out your region. So you just render that out as normal and you should be fine. So I'm going to show you how to render a region in Redshift now. So I've just got my render view here and I've got my scene here. I'm just going to keep this as progressive. I'm not going to use the bucket, but I've already made some screenshots to show you exactly what I did here to identify the area that I'm going to render, which is kind of around here. And so the way I did that is I added the object that I wanted to add to the render, which is my volleyball net here. And then I just used the region tool and I just cropped around the area that I wanted. So I just made sure that I had this up to the edge here. This is the area that I identified as, because I know that if I had this in hard light, that my volleyball net shadow is going to be over here, and because it's feathered, it's going to spread out a bit. And I've got my reflections in the sea here that I identified. Okay, so what I did is I added the volleyball net, selected the area, and then I've created a snapshot, and then I created a snapshot with no volleyball net. So I'm just going to turn this off here, and I've already made my snapshots here. So this is the, if I just come right in here, just so that you can see what we're doing here. So this is a little bit low res now because I've zoomed right in. But this is the snapshot without the volleyball net, and this is the snapshot with the volleyball net. So I know that my shadow, if I had hard light, my shadow for the volleyball net would be around here. And because I'm using soft light, then that means that this is feathered out. So if you look between the two, you can see that there's considerable difference in the shadows there. But just having a quick look, you think that they're actually the same. So I just switch that on. Switch that off and switch that on. You can see that there's shadow and it's spreading over here. The other thing I needed to check for was my reflection. So I have my reflection of my volleyball net, and this curls right around here. And so I have my region here covering that area. Okay. Unlike the interactive render region, we can't use the information here from the Redshift render view to add to our render settings. So we have to use the interactive render region again. We can use this as a guide to set up our interactive render region. So I'm just going to come over here to our perspective view. And I'm just going to bring this right up here. And I'm just going to move this over, and we can see this is the area that we want to render. So it's very hard to see what's going on in here. So what I need to do is I need to turn off my lights so that I can see exactly what I'm doing here. And before I activate my interactive render region, I'm going to come to my render settings. I'm going to change the renderer to standard, and the reason why I'm doing that is that if I keep Redshift on, Cinema 4D freezes on me, and I've had a couple of crashes and it's not good, and it really slows me down. I'm just going to make sure that I'm in the standard there, and now I can activate my interactive render region, and we can see perfectly here where we need to go. So I need to bring this corner here down to the edge here, and I need to cover half the beach ball there because I want to get these reflections that I've got here. So I need to make sure that I have my reflections in my render, and I'm just going to bring this right over to the edge here just to match here. And I'm just going to bring this up a little bit so I've got the whole of the volleyball net there. So this is the area that I'm going to render out. So this is my render region here. Okay, so now I need to come to my render settings, and if I come to my output, I can now come down to the render region here, and if I twirl that down, I can now add this information into our borders here. So I'm just going to do the same as with the standard and physical. I'm going to copy from IRR, and now that's entered into our borders here, and our render region is activated. The next thing I'm going to do is come to my save tab. I'm going to make sure that I am rendering my region into a new folder, so I'm not overwriting my original render. And I'm also going to make sure that alpha channel is checked. So this will mean that I am rendering my region and the area around it will have transparency. So when I bring that into my compositing software, then I know that I can easily overlay this on top of my original render without any problems. Okay, so that being said, with that, what I need to do is now that I've got the information from here, I can switch this off. So I'm going to switch this off. And now I can just come back into here. So now I can come back into my Redshift render view and just turn these off here. And I'll make sure that my scene is set up for rendering. So I've still got my original render settings. So I'm using the custom very high, just to reduce a lot of the noise, and I'm going to make sure that I put my lights back on. My object there is ready to render. So that's how you set up your render region in Redshift. So now I'm going to show you how to render a region in Octane, and this is my original render here, and this is looking great. I've already set up a comparison just so that we can see quickly, because I didn't want to be slowing everyone down by waiting for this to render here. So basically I've taken this image and I've used the film region and I cropped around the area that I wanted. So I'm just going to show you how I use this to determine which area that my shadows are going to fall and where my reflections are going to be, etc. So I pop my volleyball net into the scene here, and you can see that we have reflections down here in the water. And I know for a fact that if this was hard light, my volleyball net shadow will be showing just along here, and this is soft light, so this is now feathered out, and this is encompassing this area around here. So I know for a fact that this is the region that I want, but I just want to show you the comparison of before and after. And it's very, very hard to see, because if I just leave this here in the middle, you can see that this is a little bit darker here with the shadow from the volleyball net, as opposed to the area without the volleyball net. So this is slightly darker here. So you really have to watch these soft shadows with soft light. And also down here, I've got my reflection coming right down here, so I know this is where my reflection is going to be. And so I've got all my information there in my render region, and this is looking great, and this is the area that I'm going to be rendering out. So I'm quite happy with that. So with Octane, things are different. So in standard physical and Redshift, we use the interactive render region to select our area. With Octane, because we're using film region here, we can actually use this region here and pop that straight into our render settings. So I'm just going to open up my render settings here. And we don't use the output tab for this, because with standard and physical and Redshift, we use the render region here, which is underneath our custom settings. So we just come down to the Octane renderer tab, and if we come into the main tab here in the Octane renderer, we just need to come down to render region. And as the same with the interactive render region, we're looking for information here, and like the interactive render region, we also got a button which is going to be convenient for us to input this information. So get last region from LV, which is live viewer. I just need to click that, and now I've got the information of my region. I'm going to make sure that I enabled my render region here, so I need to check this box. So that's now checked. And then I need to come to my save. So I need to make sure that the render region is going to be saved into a new folder, and I'm not overwriting my original render. And I'm going to make sure that alpha channel is checked here. The other thing that we need to do is come into our Octane settings, and so I'm using path tracing here. These are all my settings, but the thing that I need to make sure is that I need to make sure that alpha channel is checked. The checkered area now is where we're going to have transparency when we bring that into a compositing software. So this is the area that we're rendering out, and everything else around it is going to have transparency. So when we bring that into After Effects or Photoshop, it's going to be easy for us to overlay this on top of the original render. Okay, and what I'm going to do is make sure that I have my volleyball net checked. We don't need to see the film region now. I'm just going to uncheck that. So I'm just going to remove my selection of render there, and so this is our scene here. So I'm just going to make sure that I am rendering my volleyball net, so I need to make sure that is turned on. So I'm going to do that. So all I need to do now is just render out this region, and then I can bring it into After Effects or Photoshop or whatever I'm using, and then I can composite it with the original render. So that's how you render a region in Octane. So now I'm going to show you a little hack. It's not so much of a secret because lots of other guys do this as well, but it might be a hack that you don't know about. So I'm just going to share this with you because this is going to really help you get your render times down on animations, which is really cool. And so I have this little guy here, he's dancing away, his little alien, and he's enjoying the day, and he's like doing the running man, getting some likes, and that's pretty cool. Okay, so I have 325 frames on my timeline here, and I needed to render a few more frames because of the dynamics on his antennae on the IK chain there. So I wanted to render a few more frames so that I can loop this easily. Okay, so I rendered out 340 frames in the end, And I was trying to get the render times down, and the render times were around about 4 minutes, and it's like, oh, that's a lot. That's going to take me a long time. And so I kind of reduced my samples, and I kind of tried to use a denoiser. That wasn't working for me either. And so I removed the denoiser and I went back to my original settings, and I had to come up with an idea of how I'm going to render this quickly. And so, I mean, I don't always do render region on things like this, because if I can get like a decent time for each frame, it's just as easy just to render those out, because I can render stuff throughout the night and pick up in the morning and it's ready for me to go. But with this one, I had to use the render region, and this is a fairly simple scene. The only animation is him dancing in the middle here with his shadow behind him. That is the only thing that is animating here. So I just rendered out one single frame, and this is the background. And then I rendered out my PNG sequence using the render region. And this is the region I rendered here. I could have got this a little bit tighter. But the shocking thing with this was how long it took me to render out this sequence here on this layer. So the original whole frame, on average, it was about 3 minutes and 50 seconds or so. It kept on changing, but that was about the average, and that would have taken me like 20 to 22 hours, depending on how long each frame rendered out. Now the shocking thing is for me is that I thought I would probably save a minute in this render. So on this render here on the render region, and this took 1.5 minutes each frame, and 340 frames. So I mean, I haven't got my calculator next to me, but it took around about 9 hours. And that's a huge difference between 20 to 22 hours. If it's 22 hours, that's 13 hours difference in render times. And I'm sort of absolutely flabbergasted with this. I'm still shocked at how little time it took to render each frame here. So that's my little hack for you. It's a really, really good thing. It all depends on your scene. It all depends on like what you got animating and stuff and that. But if render region works for you, if you're like me and you have this little area here where he's dancing around and the rest of everything is static, so like the background is static, the light isn't changing, this is the perfect scenario for using the render region. So hopefully in the future this will save you loads of time in your renders. I'm going to leave this here. So this concludes my tips, tricks and hacks for render region, and hopefully this will help you in the future with your renders. And it's not like the render region is a new thing, but it's something that's not really like known. A lot of people still don't know about it, and I think it's a really, really cool tool to use. And hopefully this will save you a lot of time and give you a lot of help in your projects. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video. And I shall let my little guy dance you out here, and he's enjoying his time. Okay, so thanks again, thanks for watching, and I shall speak to you soon. I really hope what I've shown you today has helped you in any way and you've learned something useful from this. I would love to see what you've made using this technique, so tag me on Instagram at almostdailyrender, and don't forget to like, subscribe and jingle the bell so you don't miss a thing. And as always, any questions, comments, then please leave them below. Thanks for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next video.